The revolution is real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? Lit. The revolution is lit.
Uhuru Comrades, welcome to today's Amali Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Amali Yeshitela. My name is Akilia Nai, Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. Today's study is highly important, and we encourage you right now to share this stream, invite your friends and family to it, so that as many of our people can be involved in this discussion. This week, the chairman continues his study on Chapter 3 of the book Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party, titled How the Party Survived Counterinsurgency, resuming on page 93. You can find the study materials in the Facebook and YouTube descriptions. In this study, we will learn how the party, with its nearly 50-year history, survived the U.S.-initiated counterinsurgency, a war without terms on the African liberation movement, and how, despite the difficulties of this period, the party was able to rise from the ashes of defeat to bring the Black Revolution of the 60s back to life. We ask that throughout the study, you prepare your questions regarding the topic so the chairman can expound more on certain ideas. It is my honor now to introduce the leader and founder of this party, the leader of the worldwide African Revolution, the person who carried the defeat of the Black Revolution on his shoulders and trudged forward to build the Vanguard Party, my leadership, Chairman Amali Yeshitela. Uhuru.
I thank Comrade Director of Agitation Propaganda, Akilia Naive, for not only introducing today's study, but for the incredible work that she has led with the Department of Agitation and Propaganda. We'll be talking more about that in the next several weeks at our the plenary, the first plenary of the African People's Socialist Party 7th Congress. That's going to be happening here in St. Petersburg, Florida, from February 1st through the 3rd. And well, we'll be making a report on virtually everything that the party has been involved in since the 7th Congress, which happened a little more than a year ago in October of last year. I want to just remind us again that we're not simply engaged in information consumption. Much of that approach to everything concerning the struggle and interest of African people, the ongoing internet, the stuff that we're doing now, watching and talking to each other has, in many instances, come to be a substitute for the revolutionary struggle of African people. And there's a reason for that. It is because we were involved in a genuine revolutionary movement, and the height of that revolutionary struggle, which was a part of a struggle that was happening by oppressed peoples all around the world. The United States government assaulted this movement as it killed Che Guevara, as it overthrew the government of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, as it overthrew the government and murdered Patrice Lumumba in Congo, as it has historically been involved in efforts to block any move by the oppressed to win our freedom. That happened to African people in this country. And we call it counterinsurgency. That's what governments who find themselves existing at the expense of other peoples, where peoples being held captive. And you got to remember that this social system that we experience today, the capitalist system, came into existence as a consequence of enslaving African people and colonizing the peoples around the world. And so how to maintain this relationship, this status quo, the relationship between the oppressed and the oppressor, the relationship between the owning class and those who struggle to try and produce enough just to take enough of what we produce just to survive. This struggle, how to maintain this status quo, this relationship, is something that has consumed the imperialist government, the imperialist state, the colonizer state, the United States, Europe, et cetera, and all of these entities that's come into existence through this process. How to maintain this status quo has been something that has consumed it. And the efforts by the people who are oppressed, by people who have been colonized, by countries and whole peoples who've lost their freedom to this process, that is something that is characterized as an insurgency, a struggle to overturn this. And so counterinsurgency, the ability to maintain the status quo, to maintain this relationship, to undermine any effort being made by the oppressed, by the enslaved, to win liberation, is characterized, is an art and a science that has been developed by the oppressor. It has been absolutely necessary to develop this process. We see aspects of it all the time. We see governments being overthrown. We can go back for almost forever, certainly since the inception of what we now call the United States, but even before then, efforts, whenever a people have risen up to try to win their freedom, then this process of counterinsurgency, countering that, opposing that, has been brought into play. And over a few centuries now, the need for this has meant that countries have developed a real art and science to maintain this status quo. And while people want to often determine that this effort, this assassinations, these coups and stuff, based on particular regimes, particular governments in power, the Bush regime, the Clintons, the Kennedys, et cetera, the fact of the matter is that it's been necessary since the inception of capitalism. And different regimes, heads of state, have had to assume the responsibility for doing that in order to maintain the status quo. In many ways, what you can say is that capitalism, the rise of capitalism through slavery and colonialism, through domination of the vast majority of the people of the world, has been an aggression that's imposed on the rest of the planet. Even when there has appeared to be peace, especially among the capitalist countries or within the capitalist countries and bodies, et cetera, this peace has come as a consequence of an ongoing war to maintain the enslaved in a state of slavery, to maintain the colonized in a state of colonialism. So the apparent peace is really just that, an apparent peace. It is one that has succeeded for the most part in obscuring the fact that it is a peace that has required the oppression of vast amounts of people around the world. And I'm saying this because it's important for us to understand some things about the social system that we experience, and this capitalist social system, and for Africans in particular, and those who are interested, who are not African even, in overturning this relationship of ending it. This is an extraordinarily important question. The fact that this system, this social system, has its origin in slavery and enslavement of African people, colonization, and theft of this land that we now occupy. The reason there's not so much discussion about counterinsurgency as it relates to the traditional custodians of the land is because of the U.S. has been so successful in killing so many of them and creating these concentration camps that exist almost is commonly known about. Movies have been made about it, cowboys and Indians and reservations and things like that. Nothing but concentration camps where the indigenous people try to eke out an existence. So counterinsurgency has always been there. It's been an art. It's been developed to an art. And for Africans, when we look at our status, we talk about colonialism, which is the absolute total domination of our people, of our countries, of our territories by a foreign, hostile, alien power. That's what colonialism is. And then at the moment where the struggle sharpens and makes it difficult for white power to exercise itself in its own face, then we have this thing called NeoColonialism that has emerged. So that the system will use white power in blackface. Black people who now carry out the will of white power. And I don't want to talk about this in a fashion that it appears to be quote unquote racial. What I mean is it's not people do this because they're white and we get done to because we're black, but there's powerful economic interests involved here. And that when we talk about white power, we're talking about state power. We're talking about entities that represent themselves as governments, et cetera, to protect the social system, which is the means by which whole peoples and countries feed and clothe and house themselves, and relations of production, that is to say, relations between people who own and control everything that is necessary for creating life, and people who create life for those who own and control everything. What these relationships are, this is something fundamental to how we have to come to understand this world that we live in. So people remember, sometimes with nostalgia and sometimes wistfully, based on not personal experiences, but things they've heard about or read about or they've seen videos of incredible struggles by African people inside the United States and around the world. And people, based on this, there was a time where much of the world's oppressed people truly saw Africa and African people as the vanguard in overturning this horrible social system. And that is even some of the colonizers themselves, who hated the fact that they were colonizers, hated the fact that they existed within systems as parts of systems that oppressed and exploited others. They wanted to see an end to this thing. They saw Africa and African people as being this resolution, this struggle of African people being resolution to all of this. Many people's aspirations and hopes were connected firmly to the Black Revolution of the 1960s. And it was a revolutionary period that really mobilized vast majority of people on the planet Earth. And then we look at today and it's gone. And there are not good explanations for what happened. And we hear sometimes, especially this period that we live in now, especially inside the United States, where we saw the uprisings coming out of Ferguson, St. Louis, Missouri, and many of the young people who were put in motion through the struggles of African working class folk in Canfield Drive in Ferguson, and which got out of hand more or less because the government had, the U.S. state apparatus had become accustomed in some ways to seeing rebellions happen, and they have developed a science of swooping into rebellions, capturing the energy of rebellions and turning it into some reformist kind of solution that would never solve the problem ultimately for the people. They've created instruments for carrying this out from our own communities, and not just our communities. We've seen it happen in, when I say our, I mean not just the communities of African people within the United States, but around the world. They would choose people who they would prop up and pump up as leaders and what have you, who would take us into dead ends. And so nothing has occurred, nothing has happened of any meaningful substance. And so people everywhere, including in our own communities, have asked what has happened. And some people have been victimized by this science of counterinsurgency. And I saw much of it most recently in Ferguson some 5 years ago, where the people battled the police and sufficiently long enough prior to the government being able to ship in people like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and other hustlers. There's some who also play the same role. And the struggle was so serious, and it started off. There was a consciousness that got collectivized right there on Canfield Drive in Ferguson, where people began chanting, "Kill the police," because the police had killed this 18-year-old African, gunned him down, and left his body in the streets for 4.5 hours as a warning to any other African. This is the kind of stuff that happens. This is what happens to you if you ever rise up against the colonial state power. But the people in Ferguson who stood around and watched that the murder scene and watched the police manhandling the people for 4.5 hours while that body lay there, they began this chant, "Kill the police." It was a collective consciousness that had emerged right there on the street. There was no revolutionary organization that took that on. And in fact, it was the call of the people to kill the police, such a startlingly clear, unambiguous statement about what had to be done that recognized that the police, as this arm of the state, this arm of the colonial state that occupies our communities on a daily basis, that this was a primary threat to the security of our communities, and that was the most obvious representation of colonialism in our lives, that harassed African people, especially young African people, day in, day out in our communities, that functioned clearly as an occupying military force. This is what the people said. And saying this, it was something that truly alerted us in the African People's Socialist Party, who have been struggling for more than almost 3 generations to try to resurrect the revolutionary movement that had been destroyed, that was the basis of Africans today and peoples around the world saying, what the hell happened to the Black Revolution? And many of them concluding, as did some of the young people who were organized by our enemies and our oppressors in Ferguson, St. Louis, and who were trained by our enemies and our oppressors in Ferguson, St. Louis, called them community organizers and things like this, assumed that somehow that the African population had had lost his will to struggle, wasn't interested in fighting anymore, and that now that these young geniuses were on the street with a lot of Soros monies in their bank accounts and pockets, and a lot of spaces created for them to be trained to be the community organizers that would rescue the people. And of course, they would be accompanied by the presence of big-time lawyers who came in with Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, until Jackson was literally chased out by the efforts of some of the organizers there. This situation where you have these people who now assume that it was they who were the solution, and that they were willing to dismiss and everything that has happened in the past because they were the genius. They would say silly things like, this is not your grandfather's civil rights movement. And of course, the civil rights movement of our grandfather had been destroyed by the revolution many years ago. The civil rights movement was passé. And they had no memory of that, and this which is a statement of the significance, the power of the counterinsurgency that had eradicated or distorted or obscured what real revolutionary struggle looked like and how it was emerging in the United States and around the world. So we talk a little bit about that in this chapter 3 of the political report of the African People's Socialist Party's 7th Congress that has been in book form under the chapter How the Party Survived the Counterinsurgency. And we talked about how revolutionary organizations and leaders were destroyed. Wasn't that people went on vacation? The United States government murdered them, just like they murdered Che, just like they murdered Lumumba, just like they overthrew and murdered Nkrumah, just like they had got rid of the government in the 50s of Arbenz in Guatemala, just like they had got rid of the government of Mohammed Mossadegh in the 50s in Iran, just like they've traveled the world and throughout this country assassinating and murdering anybody, any force, destroying any organization that tried to win our freedom. They did that to African people in the United States. And so, and then they didn't just do that. Part, which was counterinsurgency. When you see this is counterinsurgency, destroy the obvious revolutionary thrust of the people, force of the people, to kill the organizations and organizers, because revolution is not just a concept. People can rise up and resist, and do rise up and resist. Anytime you see colonized people, the rising up and resisting is ordinary. In fact, there used to be this thing that was said in the 1960s that repression breeds resistance. Yes, it does breed resistance, but resistance is not enough. Because revolution is necessary, and revolution goes beyond resistance, and revolution is led. It has leaders. The masses make the revolution, but the masses make revolution under leadership. And the leadership is that advanced detachment that is of the people, of the workers, of the colonized people. And the United States government recognizes this, even as some people who hate revolution in our own midst and call themselves progressives and revolutionary don't appreciate this reality. So assassinations were something happening everywhere. And it was a time of extreme crisis of this social system, because even U.S. president was assassinated. And other presidents who were not assassinated, one was overthrown, was through legal coup, an impeachment threat with Nixon. And then his vice president, Spiro Agnew, was somebody who was forced out, forced to resign even before this whole crisis that was going on. And then, as I mentioned, the assassination of Kennedy, and then the assassination of Kennedy's brother. This is the state wiping out, this is an element of the state, wiping out forces in the government. And sometimes people make the mistake of assuming that the government and the state always the same thing, but they're not always the same. As we can see with this situation with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a former head of the government, but the state He does not control all aspects of the state, or has not controlled all aspects of the state. And the state, which is this entity that comes into existence because of, in Europe in particular, because of a split between the society that cannot be easily reconciled. The state is something that emerges in order to protect the status quo, and it protects the status quo even from silliness or things that are not so silly that might fracture the relationship between sectors of the ruling class who are supposed to be the forces running governments. Governments come into being in the United States, or kept in place in the United States, through this thing they call elections. And the elections are simply, the elections themselves are a function of the state. They are simply nonviolent contests between sectors of the ruling class to determine who is going to preside over the state. And most often in the past, the elections have served that purpose, but sometimes the elections have not concluded in some definitive manner who's going to control the state. And, or as we've seen in the case of the Kennedys, where the state rise up and executes guy who's supposed to be the head of state. And we see in this instance now, when we're looking at the contradictions inside the United States, where the state actually works to undermine the government of Donald Trump. And Trump is in this perennial war with elements of the state, the FBI, the CIA, Homeland Security, the claim by certain sectors of the government and the ruling class that Trump is not even respecting our own intelligence forces and et cetera, who says that the Russians did it and Trump said they didn't do it. And I mean, it's this morass of confusion that resting on this crisis of imperialism, but the state is there all the time to protect the status quo. And if we recognize that, then we have to recognize that there has never been a time since we have been in captivity. And that's what we are. If you're an African in the United States, if you're African living today someplace on the planet Earth, you're experiencing captivity, if not directly, as in the United States, as it happened through direct slavery and direct colonialism, or indirectly as neocolonialism. The whole apparatus that has been put in place, the whole social system, and you got to remember the capitalist social system was not something that was born in Manchester or in England, or it was born as a world system coming through the process of enslaving African people, colonizing Africans and other peoples around the world. This system emerged. And clearly it's not enough for the system to have emerged in Jackson, Mississippi. It was an international, it was a world system, because this is the thing that gave rise to a world economy. A world economy was absolutely necessary for it to work, for capitalism to work. Anyway, if we recognize anything like that, then we have to recognize that since the advent of capitalism, at least, and even prior to capitalism, because it was the enslavement of Africans and others, including indigenous peoples on the lands of this America, that's what's referred to as the Americas, that created the capitalist system. So capitalism gets born through that, and the capitalist state gets born through that. Not as some local entity, as some would have us believe, as the Marxists have previously attempted to explain to us, not as some local entity. The state came from this process of enslaving, capturing African people and colonizing others and killing indigenous peoples in the Americas and other places. Capitalism arose from this, and this is the process through which the capitalist state also emerged. Which means that early on, counterinsurgency was absolutely necessary. It was counterinsurgency that put the smallpox in the blankets that were given to the indigenous people in the Americas. Counterinsurgency was in place and always in place to maintain the enslavement of African people. You'd be out of your mind if you didn't recognize that the United States government has to have, that there has to be a plan, a contingency plan to deal with African people in the United States. It has to be. It's illogical to assume, because in every instance, the thing that has fractured the solidarity and unity of the American state has been the struggles of African people. It's fractured the solidarity of the capitalist social system has been the struggle of African people. If we remember, and I'm speaking specifically of the United States right now, but if you remember, it was the revolutionary struggle of African people in Haiti that threatened the entire capitalist system. It was the struggle of African people in Haiti who defeated the French, defeated Napoleon's best, and initiated the first workers' revolution on the planet Earth. Initiate the first successful slave rebellion on the planet Earth, and determine that any slave on Earth get to Haiti, you'll get your freedom and you get land and the rest of that. This was something that challenged, you got to remember, the whole social system, capitalist system, was based on slavery at this time. And the success of Africans in Haiti threatened the capitalist system because it threatened the existence of slavery. It opened not only refuge for anybody who was enslaved, but it became a place of struggle against the capitalist system. It inspired enslaved people everywhere. Africans in the United States were inspired by the Haitian Revolution. It became the center. Most of the lessons of the African Revolution were concentrated in what was the Haitian Revolution. So counterinsurgency and the counterinsurgency has been critical to keeping Africa and African people from winning freedom and the oppressed of the world. And what was necessary to maintain the colonial domination, the theft of the land and resources of the indigenous people in the United States, the creation of this popularly known concentration camp called Indian reservations in this country. Look at Australia, look at New Zealand, look at all these other places where we see this kind of social system. Anyway, we left off somewhere around page 93, but we talked about how the party had directly experienced this. We talked up to now about how the U.S. government had initiated what had come to be known through the FBI as a counterintelligence program commonly referred to as COINTELPRO. But even that was an understatement. We talked about COINTELPRO, but we didn't talk about the CIA and chaos. We didn't talk about the military intelligence organizations that were involved in trying to maintain the status quo in the 1960s during the height of the struggle of African people here and oppressed peoples around the world. We talked about how the United States government, after killing off many of our revolutionaries and destroying our organizations, initiated a drug economy, imposed a drug economy on an African population that they were capable of starving, because that's what colonialism is. Colonialism determines what resources come into the colony, what resources leave the colony. And so the colonialism is something that can keep jobs and employment from happening, because that's what rule is by somebody else. You have your own jobs, your own industry, your own economy when you're not colonized. But when you are colonized, it's the colonizer that makes the determination of whether or not there are going to be jobs. As much as some black nationalists like to talk about, there's so many billions of dollars that the African people spend in the United States, therefore we ought to be rich, and no. The colonizer, as long as Africa and African people are controlled by an external force that has control over everything, includes whether or not we're going to make a living ourselves. And that's true of Africa and the United States, whether a job is going to be here. That's why you'll find in colonial countries, colonial communities, you won't find anything in there that the colonizer doesn't want in there. In fact, if you're like Ghana and you start building dams and other stuff that's going to make us independent and make the colonizer unnecessary, then you would be overthrown. And that's what the general movement, even of African people who were not necessarily revolutionaries in the United States, but who were talking about controlling our own economy, creating our own economy, were threats and attacked. Because the colonizer controls the economy inside the colony, or whether there's going to be an economy inside the colony. It makes places some limited economic activity may be possible, but generally speaking, no. That's why the colonizer, and Africans complain about this, because in our communities, especially in the United States and some other places, where we can't get business loans, people who themselves may be colonized in other places around the world are brought into these communities who get loans, open up shops and stores in our and African communities. And sometimes they're horrible, the treatment that we receive, but we don't control our own economy. Somebody else does. And we hate the others who come into our communities. We've come to hate the Mexicans because they take our jobs. No, Mexico can't take your job. If you had a job, it couldn't be taken by Mexicans or any damn body else. The fact is the colonizer makes it possible for somebody else to be employed in your community, to have some economic activity in your community, to maintain a constant state of dependency of the colonized. And in so doing, they can make sure that you are not employed, or you're not employed in the legal capitalist system. And when they make you not employed in the legal capitalist system, and one has to be employed in order to eat. You gotta eat, you gotta pay rent, you gotta have a place, you gotta take care of your children. And this is necessary no matter what kind of system you live in. You gotta eat, you gotta take care of your children, you gotta feed yourselves, you gotta have shelter, etc. And the way people do that is through some form of production, if they can. But if the colonizer, since the colonizer controls all the economic activity in the colony, then the colonizer will determine whether or not there's going to be any economic activity within the legal capitalist system that they establish. And they can't do that and do that. And then when they cut off access to the legal capitalist employment, then they create what they characterize as an illegal economy in the community. In this instance, we're talking about drugs. We've seen them do it most recently with this laboratory-created thing that they call crack cocaine. Made it from cocaine. It's a derivative, they say, that's created in a laboratory and put it in our community. And this is now how you can earn a living. This is how you can feed your child. And even if you're not involved in crack cocaine, you still got to eat. And if the capitalists do not make it possible for us to eat, if the colonizer does not make it possible for us to eat in the legal capitalist system, then we find ourselves having to create our own employment. And our own employment may be with what they call a Saturday night special, or 9mm, and a bandana, and it may involve taking from each other because resources are so restricted in the colony. So people are fighting over resources in the colony, seldom leaving the colony to go fight for those resources outside of the colony. That's how they did with us and infused our community with drugs of a certain kind. And then I'm speaking now of the illegal drugs, the illegal aspect, but there's illegal drugs too, or not so illegal. Now that they're legalizing the marijuana and what have you, and every pothead in the universe is celebrating because now you can legally, you can find a legal substitute for freedom. As long as you can stay high, you don't have to change the world around you, just change your thought patterns about the world around you. That's the reason, by the way, the African People's Socialist Party is opposed to marijuana usage. It's not some moral question. It's because we are materialists. We know the problem that we confront it with is not in our heads, it's in the world. And so to take something that changes how you see the world is not changing the damn world, because if you ever run out, you got the problem. If you don't run out, you're just stupid. You just get, befogged, I think is how people may characterize. That's what it is. And so as materialists, we say change the world. Change the world around you. Change the damn world. That makes it necessary for you to think that you have to befog your brain. You know? So the government imposed this drug economy on our communities, and to say that it was an economy, it had several impacts on our community, or in the world. One, it created a tremendous amount, it constituted a voluntary tax, if you will, or involuntary tax, in the sense that majority of the money that came from the cocaine and from crack sales, cocaine in this country, I mean, it was hundreds of billions of dollars annually produced from the crack. Who got that money? Definitely didn't go into housing projects where the helicopters were flying and SWAT teams were kicking down doors. Where did the money go to? And I'll tell you, it went to the stock market, it went to auto dealerships, it went to the legal capitalist economy. It kept the legal capitalist economy afloat at a time where economic crisis was profound in the United States. And guess what? That's why we say it's an involuntary tax. And that came from the most oppressed sector of the country, this taxation of hundreds of billions of dollars. Anyway, this is what was happening in this country, and Africans who had the least found ourselves trying to escape the social system, a consequence of the social system through this horrible aggression, this chemical warfare in the form of drugs that was initiated against the African population. And I should mention to you that I know there are people who just can't believe the United States government would do such a thing as this. It could, and it did. And there are a couple of interesting new books that I probably mentioned before. They tell a story, but they don't even get to the essence of what the hell happened and does happen to us and to other peoples around the world. And one of them is the Book of Chaos, and it starts with the Manson murder. I think that was 67, 68, someplace down that, around that time, where this Charlie Manson and this group of hippies killed a lot of people in the Los Angeles, Hollywood area, you know, the heir to the Folger Coffee company and movie stars and what have you, killed a lot of people. And it became a notoriously big case. And you know, there's a suggestion that the CIA through LSD, that it had recently begun to inundate the country with, played a role in the creation of Charles Manson. And there's another book, and so that's called Chaos. And there's a book called Poisoner in Chief. and this is the story of the CIA actually having scientists and universities and doctors and clinics involved, sometimes knowingly, and sometimes we are told that these clever and professors and what have you at some of the most prestigious institutions in the country, in the world, didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know they were working for the CIA, and they didn't know that the drugs they were creating were doing this or that. But it's called The Poisoner in Chief, and it's the story of a man named Sidney Gottlieb, who worked for the CIA and created all of these, torture, horrible crimes against peoples around the world and in this country as well. In fact, I've known some victims of this who I didn't know exactly how they did it or what happened until looking at this book, Poison in Chief, where they talk about a CIA program called MK Ultra. So, for the doubting Thomases, white people wrote that, so you can read it. And but it doesn't even begin to tell the story, So counterinsurgency is something that they've worked on, and there's nothing that they have not been willing to do. So they use drugs in our community. They framed up people. They even hired and corrupted the so-called moral leaders of the community, like preachers and what have you. Everybody who runs for office in the United States knows that one of the things that you do first if you're running for office is to go get the preachers the money, because the preachers are corrupt, generally speaking. So no, I'm not talking about all preachers. I'm saying, generally speaking, most preachers and those that are not are exceptions. They're corrupt, and they're parasites, and they're paid off every election, whether it's a local election in your local city, a state election, the presidential election. Everybody knows that's running for office that you go and give the money to the preachers, and the preachers will deliver the flock to be shorn. Isn't that what you do to sheep? Shorn them if you're not making lamb chops. And sometimes you don't want to make lamb chops, because if you do that, then you kill the host, and you can get 1 or 2 or 3 lamb chops, but after that you don't have the ability to. When the winter comes, you have no sweaters. So so the whole comprehensive approach to maintaining the status quo. Confusion over identity. To work constantly to make African people become something other than Africans. To sow all kinds of confusion around that question. The most recent, say within the last 20 years or so, creation of what they characterize in the census as a mixed race. We've been black people, no matter what your complexion was, we've been black forever, until black became something that no longer was simply synonymous with stupidity and other negative pejoratives, but now black is synonymous with resistance, struggle, revolution. So you minimize that, and you impact the numerical strength of the community, and you create another division within the community. Like come up with this mixed race thing. And for people who are involved in racial politics, then that's the majority of the people because the majority of the people are not engaged in struggle for national liberation. They're fighting some kind of racial thing, right? So even that is a part of counterinsurgency that we're looking at. If you're now talking about something called an ADOS, or what is it now, American descendants of a slave, you're looking at confusion sown by those who would water down, obscure, confuse the revolutionary potential of the masses of our people. And then, of course, fundamental to counterinsurgency has been NeoColonialism. As I say, this white power in blackface, disguise white power, disguise imperialism. And that's especially a powerful and potent tool to use against a population that's involved in racial politics. Because it must be all right because they're black, right? Couldn't have done it because they're black. Or couldn't be racism because the black person did it to his own people, etc. Liquidate the question of Africans and Africa as a nation of people who are struggling for national liberation, not racial liberation, national liberation. So this is part of counterinsurgency. The most sometimes seemingly innocuous kind of thing that we're confronted with on a regular basis, we're all working to keep us from coming together and winning our freedom. And the unity is a profound thing for a struggle for national liberation, and certainly within the African People's Socialist Party, we recognize that unity is sacred for the party. It's a sacred, the unity of the party is sacred. It's sacred. There's nothing that you ever read or experienced any place in the Bible or anything else that's more sacred than the unity of the revolutionary instrument, the instrument that's going to liberate our people and end the suffering of the peoples of the planet Earth. That is sacred. That is sacred. And anybody that works to destroy that unity with this false, this nonsensical stuff about what religion are you, what gender are you, whether you are gender fluid or whether you are homosexual or one of this long list of alphabets, they're going to run out of alphabets. So many divisions they want to create for the community, they're going to run out of alphabets. They're going to have to create a new alphabet to deal with all the intersectionalism and all this other kind of stuff that they throw in the midst to create confusion. That's counterinsurgency. Your professor is an agent of counterinsurgency that's teaching you about intersectionality. He won't teach you, or she won't teach you about colonialism. You're a professor that's teaching you about patriarchy. That's counterinsurgency. If you are African and engaged and oppressed, you know, how in the hell can you be oppressed by the oppressor as an African woman? Except the means through which oppression can be exercised may be different than the means through which it is exercised against African men, but as an African population, homosexual, heterosexual, man, woman, child, elderly, all of us live under colonial domination. And if there's any intersectionality at all in this process, it is the intersection between the oppressed and the oppressor. That's the contradiction, and that's called dialectics that we are dealing with. And it's they've turned counterinsurgency to this science. It gets taught. It is very innocuous. Professors, sometimes they may even wear tweed jackets and not in class, smoke pipes, or since tobacco is increasingly out with the intelligentsia, they may be vaping. But the point is that all this stuff gets put in our mix as counterinsurgency rot that keeps us from the throat of the oppressor. And that's what we need to be aiming at all the time. If you want to find what is moral, you don't have to go to the Bible to find it. You don't have to go to the Quran to find what is moral and what is immoral. What is moral is that which promotes and helps the liberation of our people, and what is immoral is anything that gets in the way of that. That's where our morality is grounded. It's simple. Anyway, we left off on a page, I think, on page 93. And so I hear somebody just whispered, read fast. And I will. So we say that The drug economy, on page 93, first full paragraph, served to demoralize and criminalize our community and provided a scapegoat for the neo-colonial African petty bourgeoisie to avoid charging the colonial rulers for the conditions we face. Don't have to charge the colonial rulers, intersectionalize it, or put it on dope. This also allowed the petty bourgeoisie to distinguish themselves as the good Negroes who, like the white colonial society, were being undermined and brought down by the African working class, the primary target of the drug offensive, who were the African working class that sagged. That's the problem. You're sagging and you're doing all this other stuff that the pretentious, civilized African petty bourgeoisie wouldn't do. And sometimes it's a nationalist petty bourgeoisie, you know. What the problem is that the men are sagging, and you can't tell the men from the women because this and that, you know. But can you tell the oppressed from the oppressor, Negro? That's the question. That's the question. In the wake of the government-imposed drug economy, the U.S. began passing laws that enabled the colonial state to round up millions of African workers who had recently been organized to revolution and put them in prison, eventually building the largest prison population in the entire world. So they didn't say putting Africans in prison because we were revolutionaries or potentially revolutionaries. They said they were putting us in prison because of drugs that were made in laboratories. Massive prison building projects were established all over the U.S. as white communities vied and fought for prisons to be able to provide colonizer nation white workers well-paying jobs at the expense of tens of millions of colonized African people stuffed into these concentration camps as their families and communities profoundly destabilized. Atrocities were and are carried out in the prisons, which created an economic boon to the white population. So now you see that part of an expression of a material basis for uniting the ordinary so-called white workers, white people, with stuffing African people into prison. There's a justification for it now. You can justify it. You can come up with a reason why they ought to be in prison. They must have done something, because they must have done something. Otherwise, I wouldn't want to be trying to make a living off of their being in prison. They must have done something. Otherwise, I wouldn't have this incentive to lock them up and African people up, etc. African communities were under siege, facing literal martial law with set curfews, amidst helicopters flying overhead as scores of repressive U.S. government organizations, deadly SWAT teams, and police programs were set up in our oppressed and impoverished neighborhoods. Police programs such as Weed and Seed and Hope 6 and vigilante neighborhood watch groups, among countless others, were established in African working class communities all over the U.S. African children were farmed out to white women who earned small fortunes as foster mothers, who tortured and in some cases mutilated our children in violation of the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crimes of Genocide. One such case around which the party waged a powerful campaign was that of Yvonne Eldridge, a white woman from Walnut Creek, California, a suburb of Oakland. Eldridge made over $10,000 a month, housing scores of African children from the foster care system, whose parents were victims of the U.S. government's imposition of crack cocaine in the African community. And what would happen is if a woman who had a baby and they found cocaine in her system, the child was taken from her at birth, and stuck in one of these foster homes. Eldridge consciously made the children ill, killing at least 3 African babies and submitting at least 8 others to abuse, including cutting intravenous cords and reporting non-existent symptoms to doctors who collaborated by performing surgery to remove the infant's organs. This happened. I mean, she had the spleen. These are babies. She had the spleen removed, and all of this because if something was wrong with the doctor, they got more money. They got more money from the foster care thing. There were women who didn't know anything about African children, didn't know how to take care of the African girl's hair. So she cut it all off and then tied a bow around her bald head so that she could be distinguished as a girl, or put a perm in a baby's hair. This is the kind of stuff that our children go through, and the humiliation that our people experience as a colonized people. So Eldridge, struggle led by the party forced the state to finally indict and bring Eldridge to trial. But her defense was she suffered from this thing that some kind of Munchausen by proxy disease. And this is an illness that appears to afflict white women who want the attention of doctors, so they make the children sick so they can go to doctors. But it's BS, because Eldridge has children of her own, and none of them were made sick to go see the doctor. These were the children who she was making profit from, and more profit if they were ill. So political debate within our oppressed communities was neutralized by assassinations and other forms of counterinsurgency, including the foundation of the inundation of drugs in the African community. Quoting from Advanced Detachment again. It took an all-out urban war against the black working class in the 60s for a return to imperialist class peace and the reinstatement of the facade of the two-party system, supposedly representing the class interests of all people. This war saw African workers stand up alone, not only against armed police organizations, but even armed military forces that usually reserved for foreign U.S. intervention. And we're talking about then, we say that the African workers had to stand up alone, not only against armed police organizations, but even armed military forces usually reserved for foreign U.S. intervention. Listen, we're talking about, it is widely known, especially by really smart and intelligent and well-read so-called Marxists and white Leninists, Marxist-Leninists, about what happens to African people. The same data that I get about the numbers of Africans in these prisons. I read the same stories about Africans being gunned down and killed in our communities, either by the state or by white people at large. There is no general struggle among so-called white left, the white peace movement, or anything that deals with what's happening to African people in this country. None, none, none. It's a bogus left. It's a bogus anti-imperialist movement. And so we've had to fight this by ourselves. Somebody say, well, you're trying to be divisive, you're separatist. No, 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 no. We are having to fight this battle because we've been made separate. We've been put in this situation, and our separation is simply a statement of our status as a colonial and subject people who are having to fight, generally speaking, with the exception of what we have created in terms of the African People's Solidarity Committee and the Uhuru Solidarity Movement. Without that, we are alone. We are alone in making this struggle. And what we have successfully done as a part of our struggle against the counterinsurgency is to open up a whole new front struggle in the colonizer community itself, among white people yourself, within the white community itself. This is what we have done. We've had to do this, otherwise we are again alone. In Detroit, this includes the 82nd Airborne Division. In urban areas throughout the U.S., military tanks and an assortment of other sophisticated armaments were deployed against the unarmed black working class communities. The U.S. ruling class used its military power, its state power, to defeat the independent revolutionary capacity of the African working class, the only internal social force that made it necessary to defend the capitalist social system. The African working class was the only social force inside the United States that was capable of challenging the bourgeoisie for power, the fundamental question in any revolution. The power, the fundamental question in any revolution, Any Marxist understands this, supposed to understand this. Any so-called leftist, any so-called communist understand the struggle is for power. And then, which is why when they want to fight for power, where do they come? They come to the African community, go to the Mexican community. They'll not go among the white people to make the struggle to get rid of the system. Because they know the white people eat them alive, because the majority of the white people have some kind of association with the ideas of Donald Trump is pushed up to the surface for everybody around the world to see. If not Trump, then Boris Johnson or some other forces that live as colonial overlords of the reality that we are confronted with. So we say that for all these years subsequent to the military defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s, the bourgeoisie has expended a tremendous amount of energy and resources in keeping the African working class politically disoriented, disorganized, and unable to come together organizationally in its own class interests, unquote. The whole of the North American colonial community of intellectuals hungrily jumped on the anti-African bandwagon. A concerted effort to use the consequences of the drug economy to prove the pathology of the African community became a goal of colonial academics, colonial academia. And this stuff was popping up at the time and all over the place. You know, like there's a pathology. The African community is pathological, it's ill, it's sick. And therefore, all the stuff that we have to do to it, take the children, cordon them off, and do all these other things is just, this is the academia. This is universities and professors and stuff teaching this. And Hillary Clinton made her infamous statement calling African children super predators in 1996, following on the heels of her husband's 1994 counterinsurgent crime bill, which implemented the 3 strikes you're out clause targeting African people and install 100,000 new cops on the streets of African communities all over the U.S. This is Clinton's. And this is the white woman that all of them were clamoring to follow, and in a crime bill that was written by whom? Do you know who wrote the crime bill? Who is the leading Democrat contender now for the nomination president? Joe Biden. And all of the Negroes, he's as a favorite right now in the polls among the Negroes. Clinton, Biden, they wrote the crime bill. And the police is the front line of the colonial force that keeps African people in the situation that we're in today. Petty bourgeois, pro-independence, black nationalists from a variety of organizations joined in on this attack on the African working class. In some instances, actually supporting the colonial occupying military forces in their attacks on the colonized population in the name of, quote unquote, taking back our communities. At least one organization, the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa, the RNA, made participation in the US-led war against drugs, as it's called, a part of its strategy to weasel reparations from the white rulers because, as they put it, we can use the money, unquote, to give RNA's drug-fighting, quote, efforts a boost. Like other apologists for the colonial terror being inflicted on our community, these black nationalists, would-be leaders, defined the US-imposed drug economy and its aftermath as self-inflicted. Our party took on a deep, and we should add futile, struggle with the RNA and other so-called pro-independence organizations for more than 5 years. We struggled that the African Revolution cannot move forward without defeating the counterinsurgency, the most important question of that period, and that we must defend the besieged African working class. Our book, Black Power Since the 60s, which is a chronicle of those struggles, notes, quote, we initiated this discussion, this struggle against opportunism, as part of a process to solve the outstanding problems of the revolution. The vicious counterinsurgent colonial war that defeated the Black Revolution of the 60s continues to immobilize our revolutionary process today. We must overturn the counterinsurgency as a condition for moving our revolution forward. Hence, our current fixation on the counterinsurgency. For while there are a handful of anti-colonial African organizations, some of which might actually do political work, it will take revolutionary work to liberate us. It is as simple as that. And revolutionary work is that work which correctly sums up and acts upon the period in which we exist and struggle. But for this to happen effectively and consistently, such work must be informed by advanced revolutionary theory. For years now, the African People's Socialist Party has been attempting to win the U.S.-based African anti-colonial movement to the significance of the U.S. counterinsurgency. We have held tribunals, forums, symposiums, and mass mobilizations to expose the counterinsurgency. The article from the Burning Spear which make up this book, the articles from the Burning Spear which make up this book expose the actual participation of two groups, the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa and the Nation of Islam, in so-called anti-drug counterinsurgent activity. But others have also participated in one way or another as well. The Nation of Islam, under the leadership of Minister Louis Farrakhan, initiated a campaign of so-called dope busters, which achieved notoriety with a televised beating of a so-called drug pusher in Atlanta, Georgia. The New African People's Organization, initiated some sort of Take Back the Streets campaign based on the assumption that violent African youth gangs or drug pushers control the streets of our colonized communities and not the militarized colonial police, who are the first line of counter-revolutionary resistance to our struggle against colonialism. We of the African People's Socialist Party have argued that while we must struggle to achieve control of our communities as part of the struggle against domestic colonialism, the activities of these groups bow to the definition of the primary contradiction in our community as defined by the colonial white ruling class, especially since none of them is involved in campaigns to bust the slumlords or the cheating avaricious merchants or violent white vigilantes. None of them has campaigned to take back the streets from ski mask wearing police thugs who violate our communities daily. This coincidence of interest with the campaigns and definitions of the white ruling class and media validates the counterinsurgent activities of the colonial ruling class and state. It validates the counterinsurgency itself, notwithstanding the hollow protestations of the groups to the contrary. So we're not saying there's something wrong, because I believe that we're going to have to take over our communities. We're going to have to, but who do we take the communities over from? From colonialism, from the state, from the colonizer. And that means in the process of doing that, we will get rid of the drug dealers and all of the other things, and we have engaged in such struggles. But to make the drug people dealers on the street the primary contradiction, while not doing a damn thing or even raising the contradiction, not even exposing the fact there's a counterinsurgency that's putting the drugs in our community in the first place. That's who employed them. We had a saying in the party at the time that the U.S. government is the biggest employer in our community, but that's who's hiring the people to push drugs in the community, and you got to target them as well. They didn't do that. The approach of our party has been to identify the counterinsurgency and all its obvious components as a primary contradiction, and to attempt to win all in our oppressed colonial communities who can be won to struggle against the counterinsurgency, including the government importation of drugs into our community and the vicious war against our people in the name of a war against drugs. This approach makes the government the enemy and calls on everyone, including the penny-ante drug dealers, to unite with the governments, to unite against the government in every way, including a cessation of distribution and use of drugs. The other approach makes the African youth the enemy and unites with a government campaign against them. As our party is summed up, unquote, as our party is summed up, the African working class was demoralized and under intense ideological and political assault, exacerbated by our apparent voluntary participation in the illegal drug economy that had been organized by the U.S. government and made possible in part by the counterinsurgency war that effectively neutralized the most influential organized components of the anti-colonial struggle. So, you know, they can do this. They kill Panthers, they kill revolutionary forces on the streets. Then, because who took back the streets in the first place? It was Panthers who were walking door to door, organizing people in the communities and getting them involved in anti-colonial projects, the sickle cell anemia project, and the party who organized the blood bank for African people, JOMO, and all these forces. The communities belong to us. And the government put the dope pushers on us. The government put the drugs in our communities and what have you. They were the employers of these things. And so we target the government. Who had an interest in doing that? Did the community have an interest in inflicting itself with these horrible wounds? No, no, no. It was the government. It's the colonial government. And most of these militants don't even have the ability to condemn the government, to even assume the government is capable and willing to do the things that it has done and continues to do up to now. It was this voluntary aspect of the drug war that made the counterinsurgency so effective. It gave the appearance of the victim being the perpetrator, even to the victim. Nevertheless, there was a common refrain within the African colonized that recognized, quote, "We don't have the planes and ships to bring the drugs into our community," unquote. This popular statement echoed countless speeches, spear articles by myself, and demonstrations held by the party-led organizations over many years. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana, introduced the term neocolonialism to the world in his 1965 book, NeoColonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. And then we took that definition that Nkrumah used beyond what Nkrumah had done, because Nkrumah talked about neocolonialism, but he didn't talk about the class forces that were responsible for carrying out the neocolonial mission in our communities. That is to say, where is the base, the social base for this white power in blackface? And that's the African petty bourgeoisie. And that's what we have brought to this discussion of neocolonialism. So we say on page 100, at the third full paragraph, as we explained in the political report to the 6th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party, An Uneasy Equilibrium, the African Revolution versus Parasitic Capitalism, quote, our party has been able to advance the understanding of neocolonialism, giving it a class character and identifying the African petty bourgeoisie as a social base from which it springs. Throughout the world, when the movement for liberation grew to an extent that masses rose up with the blood-curdling cry of "kill the white man" or "kill the police," it became no longer tenable for white power to exercise its rule directly. Indirect rule, neocolonialism, white power in blackface became necessary. The mass struggles for liberation necessitated an obvious transfer of political power from the white colonizer to the black colonizer. When we say an obvious transfer, it means that an apparent transfer, what it looks like a transfer of political power from the white colonizer to the black colonizer. This serves to obscure the fact that the white colonizer continues to dominate the colonized through control of the economy and hence control of the politics of the colonized. Neocolonialism is a concept developed by Kwame Nkrumah to define the new face of colonialism. Nkrumah taught how the continued control of African community economies allowed for indirect rule by the same powers. However, it was our party that defined African neocolonialism according to their class character. It was we who recognized the role of class in the implementation of neocolonial rule. This had not been previously understood. In our 1991 pamphlet, Dialectics of Black Revolution, the struggle to defeat the counterinsurgency in the U.S., we showed how the U.S. government deepened the counterinsurgency against the African Revolution using neocolonialism. With the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s, the strategic target of the counterinsurgency shifted to include the entire African population with emphasis on the African working class employed and the increasingly enlarged unemployed. So with the defeat of the Black Revolution, the counterinsurgency target, the strategic target of the counterinsurgency shifted. During the height of the revolution, the strategic target of the counterinsurgency was what? The leaders and organizations that were leading this and promoting this. So that's where the assassinations, the jailing, the destruction of organizations became important. Now, with the defeat of the revolution, the counterinsurgency strategic target shifts to include the entire African population, and this is where it was before. That's what Jim Crow and all this other stuff constituted, total domination of the African population. Then the rise of the struggle that created what would be characterized as a vanguard, a leadership. Then the leadership had to be targeted to get out of the way so they can get back to the people. And so this is what happened with the counterinsurgency: destroy the revolutionary organizations, assassinate leaders, jail people, mass incarcerations of people. And when I say leadership, I'm not just talking about people standing on the top. I'm talking about those young people who worked in the housing projects, going door to door, selling newspapers and things like that, and became the beacon for resistance and revolution in our communities. They became targets to mass sweeps of African people. Laws now created to make sure that Africans were going to be going to prison in huge quantities all around this country became the rule. And so we say that an essential component of the counterinsurgency is a drug economy imposed on our economically dependent colonized community by the U.S. government. Accompanying this was the cynically deployed war on drugs used to justify a near total abrogation of the national democratic rights of African people that we fought and died for. So now they liquidate the significance of the so-called civil rights movement that supposedly brought rights to us that we never had before, that they bombed churches and killed babies and stuff to keep from occurring, to keep this civil rights from materializing. Now that we got there, then they kill us off, and they come up with these are targets now to justify taking them back from us in the struggle, so-called war against drugs. So you saw the near total abrogation of the national democratic rights of African people that we fought and died for. To facilitate the criminalization of the African community, the counterinsurgency also utilizes a neo-colonial policy which elevated thousands of Africans as elected officials and administrators. This has served to deflect consciousness of a defeated black revolution and gives a false sense of African quote-unquote progress. And neocolonialism acts as a cover for the counterinsurgency, either through the silence of these officials or through their actual hands-on participation in the attack on our people. Such was the case with the 1985 bombing of an African community in Philadelphia under the direction of an African mayor, Wilson Good. But we've seen that in St. Petersburg, Florida. I mean, there's a person now who is in the state senate of a Negro who's in the state senate now as a reward, in part for his work against the African People's Socialist Party after the police had murdered Africans, and we built an incredible movement that lasted for several years and forced them to have to be discussing changing a public policy of police containment of African people for a public policy of economic development of the African community. He was a conscious participant, and who would come out and tell us in demonstrations we were involved in that every time you have a demonstration, I make some money. And he was being paid and hired by the bourgeoisie and bragged about it to be able to deflate the struggle of the people. And he now endears himself to African people, not for any political work that he does, some false stuff that he may do, and because he reads the obituaries and then sends some kind of resolution from Senator so-and-so to the funerals of dead Africans, etc. In our book, Black Power Since the 60s, in the chapter, The Counterinsurgency Against Our People and the Response of the Black Movement, quote, unquote, we provided the example of Washington, D.C. as a template for U.S. counterinsurgency with the complicity of the neocolonial class. And this is what we got. Quote, on April 10th, 1989, the U.S. capitalist white power government revealed the newly unfolding form of the government's counterinsurgency against our people's just struggle for freedom and repossession of the material wealth stolen from us by 400 years of slavery and foreign domination. April 10 was the day that William J. Bennett, the National Drug Policy Director, this is a drug policy director, this is somebody who's been given a job to use the cover of fighting against drugs for enhanced colonial control and terror against African people. April 10th was the day that William J. Bennett, the National Drug Policy Director, or Drug Czar, that's probably correct, Drug Czar, under then U.S. President Ronald Wilson Reagan, flanked by Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Jack Kemp and Richard Thornburg, U.S. Attorney General, outlined an incredible state of martial law for Washington, D.C., that is public consolidation of a general campaign directed against the domestically colonized African population. Bennett's plan, which effectively nullified the election of the sleazy neo-colonialist Marion Barry administration and returned the D.C. government to a direct white control, calls for the deployment in Washington, D.C. of a so-called metropolitan area task force consisting of representatives from the Drug Enforcement Administration, FBI, U.S. Marshal Service, Department of Defense, U.S. Attorney's Office, Internal Revenue Service, Immigration and Naturalization Service, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, U.S. Customs Service, Park Police, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, and state and local police agencies from Maryland and Virginia. The immediate effect of Bennett's action, these are the agencies that they put in charge of Washington, D.C. A guy was elected. He's a sleazeball. But many Africans elected him, and they kept electing him over and over again. The immediate effect of Bennett's action was a legal coup d'etat as a means of countering one profound security problem for world capitalism led by U.S. imperialism, namely the seat of international white power, the U.S. capital sitting in the middle of a population that is 70% African and extremely hostile toward the U.S. colonial government and its domestic and foreign policy. In a sense, Bennett's attack on African people in Washington, D.C. is testimony to the growing limitations of neocolonialism as the main strategy for U.S. imperialism in its war against African people. The fact is that the authority of the black puppet regimes established by white power in cities throughout the U.S. is wearing thin for the millions of oppressed and literally starving African working and poor people. The neocolonialism, more appropriately called Negro colonialism by some party members, became a chief component of the counterinsurgency against our struggle following the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s. Hundreds and thousands of well-trained, generally educated individuals who together make up the worst kind of social scum were recruited to the service of white power in the form of black elected officials, administrators, and policy initiators such as civil rights groups and personalities. Their job was to act as political covers for white power by allowing it to assert itself against our people through themselves or their programs. Our party has made it clear from the very beginning of our existence that the African petty bourgeoisie as a class will always betray the African Revolution, which must be led by the African working class, with fierce adherence to its interests. As we laid out in our 1981 book, Bread, Peace, and Black Power, political report to the first Congress of the African People's Socialist Party, quote, "This epoch of struggles and victories over neocolonialism and dependency represents the leading revolutionary tendency in the world today. It is an epoch which finally thrusts humanity upon the threshold of world socialism, for it challenges the very foundations upon which world capitalism is built. This epoch of struggles and victories over neocolonialism and dependency directly threatens the primitive and non-capitalist accumulation of capital upon which world capitalism was constructed and without which it cannot survive in its present form," unquote. The neocolonial strategy of the imperialist powers continues to serve the colonizers today, if not so well. Only our party, the Vanguard and Advanced Detachment, never stopped defending, engaging, and upholding the interests of the African working class, while neo-colonial politicians and celebrities such as Jesse Jackson viciously attacked them. In later years, Bill Cosby joined in the attack on African workers. Today, thanks to the counterinsurgency, there are an astounding 2.3 million people in U.S. prison, a 500% increase, since the 1970s when our party was founded. This is the context that the U.S. population has only increased This is in the context that the U.S. population has only increased by 48% in that time period. So you have a 500% increase in the number of people thrown into prison, while the population has only increased by 48%, not 48 times. But so you have 48% increase in the population, a 500% increase in people thrown in prison since the 1960s. Colonized Africans and indigenous people inside the U.S. officially account for 37% of the U.S. population, yet we represent 67% of the prison population according to the Sentencing Project. We should note that those African prisoners who register as mixed race are now counted as white, allowing the U.S. government to give the appearance that the number of African prisoners in the U.S. has declined in recent years. African men, colonial subjects, are nearly 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men. I'm saying this, it's important. The state is the state. The state has existed since society was split into irreconcilable contending forces, workers, bosses, feudalists, landlords, nobility, et cetera, et cetera. The state also acts against white people. But the difference is it's the colonial state. The colonial state. And you see that, yes, some white people go to jail, but look at how Africans go to jail. Because we are the colonized. To maintain the status quo, white people get put in jail too. But so few. And look at our communities that's inundated with cops, with forces. If there were many cops in the white community looking for everything as they do in the African community, you'd have many more white people in prison as well. But the contradiction that the state has to deal with to protect the status quo is located in the African community, located in the so-called Indian reservations and in the barrios where the Mexicans and other people exist. That's why they had to come up with this special contradiction with Salvadorians, gangs, and stuff like that to give them a specialized kind of treatment. Even as you got white militia forces running around with loaded weapons and preppers who even got anti-tank and anti-missile weapons that they show on TV from time to time, because the colonial contradiction is the fundamental contradiction. And that's where you find the colonial, that's where you find the state apparatus most deftly and ubiquitously employed. So we say African men, colonial subjects, are nearly 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men. And federal courts imposed prison sentences on African men that were 19% longer than those imposed on similarly situated white men between 2011 and 2016. In 2015, 48,043 children were in U.S. juvenile prisons, of which 44% were African. There are about 1,600 children in the United States serving life sentences without parole, 80% of which are colonized African children. The U.S. is the only country in the world that sentences children to life in prison. 1 of every 8 people in prison on the entire world is an African man in the United States. This is significant not only because the large populations of China and India must be factored into the equation, but also because the entire billion-strong population of colonized Africans throughout the world is factored in. In other words, the concentration of a state utilized against Africans in the United States is significantly different than any place else in the world, because here we are in the center of imperialism. And what we do has implications for the entire social system internationally. It's abundantly clear that the leap in prison incarceration within the U.S. is a direct result of U.S. counterinsurgency that crushed the black revolution of the 60s. A host of designer laws created especially for our movement and people were initiated in virtually every politician running for political office, often including Africans, ran on a platform or a public policy of police containment of the African community. So while it was clearly a war against our struggle for liberation from a hostile and alien foreign domination that is usually recognized as colonialism, the North American population rested upon a parasitic foundation, was able to feign ignorance of the murderous assault against our movement. As we wrote in the main resolution to the First Party Congress, published as A New Beginning, The Road to Black Freedom and Socialism in 1981, quote, in the U.S., imperialism was constructed off the enslavement of African people and the near decimation of the native population. This system has been the cornerstone of world capitalism since the Second Imperialist World War, which means, among other things, that the resources, the wealth, the near slave labor of the vast majority of the peoples of the world have been the basis for the development not only of the wealth of the ruling class, but of the entire North American society. Consequently, the basis of opportunism within the U.S. are very deep, unquote. White people were an objective component of the U.S. counterinsurgency, especially the whites who love us, as they were characterized in Occupied Azania by Robert Sobukwe, a primary leader of our struggle there. These whites were the leftists, including Marxists and other socialists and communists, who made regular forays into our communities from the comfortable and generally safe libraries and cafes where they usually resided. They all expressed sympathy for our plight and cause, but not enough to get off our backs or to unite with our fight for self-determination. With few exceptions, they did not recognize that the socialism or communism they claimed to seek was to be found in the struggle for the liberation of our people. Instead, they sought to show us the error of our ways and introduce us to the science of revolution that required Africans and other colonized within current borders of the U.S. to submit to the leadership of the colonizers that they call workers. And so, anyway, there's so much more that I should have read, that I should have been able to get to. Let's see. I guess we should go ahead and open it up to discussion. Now, where did I stop on page? 107? Beginning of 108. Okay. Go ahead. So thank you, comrades. I'm self-critical. I do hope that, I'm hoping that people are reading this even when we're not together like now, and also that people will not hesitate to raise whatever kinds of questions or struggles they might have with anything that's been raised up to now. Uhuru.
Uhuru, let's salute our leadership, Chairman Amalia Shatella, for that powerful study. Uhuru, Chairman. It is now time to open up with questions from our audience and online viewers. We want to appreciate everyone who's tuning in via Facebook and YouTube, and also appreciate all of your engagement. Please continue to invite your friends and family to the study and share widely on all of your social media platforms. I want to go ahead and recognize where people are viewing from: Clearwater, Florida; St. Petersburg, Florida; Tampa, Florida; Fort Myers, Florida; Roselle, New Jersey; Rotterdam, Netherlands; Chicago, Illinois; St. Louis, Missouri; Tucson, Arizona; Kansas City, Missouri; Huntsville, Alabama; Richmond, Virginia; Hempstead, New York; New York, New York; Oakland, California; San Diego, California; the Philippines; Schiedam, Netherlands; Sydney, Australia; Newark, New Jersey; Maryland; Louisiana; and St. Joseph, Missouri. We had Comrade Raya Fogarty in St. Louis comment, "Absolute genocide against African people. Reparations now." Penny Hess, chairwoman of the African People Solidarity Committee, says, "Saluting your profound and very moving overview on the depth of the counterinsurgency against African people and the very necessary and truly moral struggle for African liberation." She also asks, "Chairman, could you address how the colonizer does not target a race with counterinsurgency, only an oppressed people fighting for their liberation, and what that means for white people?"
Yeah, I just think this, we've been subjected for a very long time to what has become, if it did not begin, a real counterinsurgent ploy to define Africans and others as races. While you have French, you have Germans, you have Americans, quote unquote, you have the Dutch and everybody else, and then you have these races of people, which really, it has a serious implication for the struggle, because if the problem is race or racialism, you can't change that. There's nothing you can do to change your race. And if it were possible, with as much money as Michael Jackson had, he would have done it. And he did damn near everything possible to do that, and he's still paying a price for being an African as we have this discussion. So it's a trap, that one is in, and so that you're perpetually engaged in trying to deal with something like race, where the success to be found is to identify who we are as a nation of people who have been forcibly dispersed at gunpoint. And the reason that someone can get away at some time with calling me an African American, this is the nicest thing they've called me since I've been introduced to these shores, is because they have destroyed my consciousness of the fact that I am one of a whole people. And this whole people is under assault. And what happens is, if you're fighting against quote unquote race, we find ourselves too often fighting as individuals because of an incident that occurred to us. Got treated badly at a restaurant, or the cop shot us because of racism, and then they say, well, it can't be racism because the cop who shot him was African, or was black, or something to that extent. Where colonialism is something that peoples around the world have engaged in. I'm really calling on people who are participating in this study and this discussion on today to really look at the issue of colonialism and how it has been struggled around and defined, especially since the 1960s. Because if you understand the question of colonialism, you cannot deny the fact that Africans here in the United States and around the world suffer from a form of colonialism. Even what has been characterized as slavery of African people has to be considered a form of colonial slavery, because the slavery that has been used as the template for even defining what slavery is something that happened with white people. But even the word slave comes from Slav, like Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, some of the Slavic people. That's where the word slave comes from, and something happened to African distinctly different from what the Romans did way back then, where people talked about slavery. Now we're talking about an entire continent of Africa, 12 million square miles, that has been turned into a place for the production of human beings who would be sold and used as capitalist commodities and treated and called slaves. So the issue of slave, the issue of races, etc., obscures who we are and what it is. And it also, this racial thing, it's laden with so much subjectivism, because, white people who are not racist, can really love us, and they can be upset, even when we do something, because we don't let them love us, and we are these objects of love and pity and everything else, but we are a nation of people, and true solidarity comes not by the white people who quote unquote love us, but who unite with the efforts and struggles that we are engaged in to win our liberation, our total, absolute control of our own lives and the future of our own people. Uhuru.
Thank you, Chairman. Akim from Schiedam, Netherlands asks, music influences the youth greatly. Pop music, hip hop, rap often worship individualism, consumerism. Are these artists spreading APSP's message, planting the seeds of African internationalism? Uhuru.
Generally not, but what has always happened with popular cultural expressions is the strength of the movement will influence what that looks like. And some of the most popular, most amazing music that came from the 1960s clearly had their energy and their message, even if it was filtered through the peculiarities of the personalities and sometimes even class interests of the artists. The struggle of black people had a powerful influence on what these popular cultural expressions look like. And I would think about Aretha Franklin, and the energy and power, and even the character of the music itself. The strength of the revolution, like blues during a time of where the struggle, where the oppression was the main feature of our existence. It's the blues that we sing. And then when you see during the period where a certain kind of resistance began to emerge, as rhythm and blues that emerges. And then, you see outlier music that's, coming in form of reggae and other things like that. I mean, it is informed by struggle. And I believe that we do what we can and to directly challenge and confront artists to get them on the right side of the question. But in the final analysis, the work that we do among the masses of the people to build this revolutionary movement will determine what the artists are going to do. The reason artists do what they do, even though they think themselves clever, is that they're stupidly being led by corporations that have determined that the way to make money is through corporations. And also you have intervention by intelligence organizations in these corporations. Sometimes they establish corporations for the purpose of doing that, spreading garbage into our communities. So our job is to revolutionize the consciousness of ordinary African people by taking the struggle to them. And that will impact what artists will be doing, because we're going to bring up a whole new generation of artists from the bowels of the oppression and exploitation that we experienced and the resistance that we put forth. And we've seen, a hint of that from time to time.
Uhuru, question from Comrade Ikemba in Philadelphia says, Uhuru Chairman, I appreciate the political education. You can surf the internet all day and you will not find a leader today giving this kind of analysis to African people. In the wake of the murder of a pig, of the murder of a pig in North Jersey in New York, the NYPD is now going to implement a program that will prevent hate crimes before they take place. What will this mean for the African Revolution?
Well, some time ago, the United States government began this enhancing sentences and things like that based on whether or not they were hate crimes. If somebody says, let's kill the niggers, or let's paint a dirty words on a Jewish synagogue, then that was characterized as a hate crime. And some of these liberals, really champion that. They really bit on to that. So that's wow, how wonderful that is. And Facebook does stuff like that. It's counterinsurgency. Because the fact is that if an African attacks a colonizer as a colonizer, that colonizer is most commonly understood to be and recognized as a white man. And so if an African says, we can get this hunky, kill this white man, then that African has committed a hate crime. It is something that's going to be applied to Africans and forces who are engaged in resistance against the colonizer. That's where you're going to see the hammer fall. Not so much against these, that's where the hammer is going to fall. But it's also going to be used against people who attack some of the prized victims I say prized. I mean, the ones that are held up and as the victims, protected victims, because they serve imperialism to be victimized. You know what I mean? So that's what we're dealing with. Yeah, Uhuru.
So this comment comes from Comrade Tachara Masimba in St. Louis, says the class basis of counterinsurgency is so important. Those who don't get it will often conclude that the reason the party has not unified all the black people in the world is because we are not skilled at social media, we have not gone out to talk to enough people, we are too mean or too narrow in our political line, we do not possess the brilliant technological and organizational skills held by the bourgeoisie. While we can and should constantly strive to improve in all these areas, the essential contradiction is always a class contradiction, and there is a material basis for class contradictions.
I want to appreciate that observation by this comrade. I want to say that this counterinsurgency that we are talking about now was something that really exploded with sharper definition and intensity in the 1960s when the world was on fire, because the slaves were setting fire to the plantations everywhere around the world. I'm reminded of Dessalines from Haiti. who coined the term, how does he say, coup d'etat, how do you say it? Coup d'etat Bulekai, right? Cut their heads and burn the houses. And Dessalines was different from Toussaint Louverture, who thought that it was possible to take over the same structures and institutions that the French had. And Dessalines' position was destroy everything, burn everything, because if you leave anything, they will come back to power, right? And I'm just saying that, what was the basis that the original question that this comrade T'Challa? Yeah, that the recognition of this class question, because all of us are engaged in a struggle for national liberation. All of us are engaged in oppression, national oppression, regardless of the class that we come from. That's why you will find when sometimes an African can get away, reactionary can get away with saying there's no such thing as class, because all of us are niggers to the white man. The white man just see niggers, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some truth to that, because that's the African nation that's being defined, and there's national oppression everywhere. But in the struggle for national liberation, a class struggle is also raging. Sometimes it's not seen. Who is going to lead this damn struggle, and what's going to be the outcome? Will we have a Bill Cosby outcome? You know, will we have what's this guy's name who was just the president? Obama outcome? We'll have an Al Sharpton or Jesse Jackson outcome? You know, the question is, what will be the outcome? And will the masses of people who are responsible for producing every damn thing that is there and who's lost everything in the process, will the outcome be one that empowers us and overturns the kind of social system? So the class question is important, because the petty bourgeoisie will fight to preserve the same system. In fact, you will find they will condemn the party in their places where we do work. And people, they watch us from the sidelines. We accomplish stuff in months that they have had years to do and never did any of it and have no intent to do it. But what they would do is they would take what we have done and they would create some imitation of something that looks kind of sort of like it to try to give the illusion of having done something. In Oakland, California, we made the struggle in the most impoverished communities. And this was in the 1980s, in the housing projects. We took African people free child care, and we took African people a Bobby Hutton clinic on mobile, on a trailer, in a mobile vehicle. We turned an RV, is that what you call a recreation vehicle, into a clinic, and took it into the heart of the most oppressed sectors of the community to provide health care. And people, we had to actually, sometimes people would get on there, we'd take their blood test pressure, and literally had to rush people from there straight to the hospital because they were in such desperate conditions. And then the neo-colonial African government in Oakland, California, prohibited us from going in there anymore. First, they created their own mobile clinic that they never thought about doing before, prohibited us from going into there. And with their own clinic, they were able to diffuse what immediate kind of anger that the people might have had until after we had been out of place long enough, and then they cut off theirs as well. So the class question is a fundamental question. The outcome is critical, and sometimes the petty bourgeoisie is more afraid of the African working class than the others, than the actual colonizers are afraid of us. So yeah, that's a serious issue.
Uhuru. Well, thank you again, Chairman. And just want to say, because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question wasn't answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the chairman sees your question. There were some really great questions, some things about socialism, capitalism, that we did not get to. So, that's why we say, type those questions in early. As soon as you get them, put them in so we can get them on the live. But we'll be able to deal with them.
I want to speak I think I got a minute. Yep. This thing that T'Challa just mentioned, this question, because you will find, like we had issues and struggle with the Black Panther Party, which has never prohibited us from recognizing that the Black Panther Party at one juncture was the center of the revolutionary movement in this country and in many places around the world. But you have these militants who belatedly claim that the reason the Black Panther, and you have white leftists and then some Negroes, radicals, claim that the Black Panther Party somehow had these inherent internal contradictions that was the basis for its demise. And, that's so offensive, because, it's like in 1968 alone, more than 30 members of the Black Panther Party were murdered by government throughout the United States. They were infiltrated, they were attacked on every front, so this whole, and more than 300 of them were swept up in prison sweeps, locked up, etc., while these people are sitting on the sidelines who have now decided what the problem was. And yes, I had struggles and still have struggles with some things, and some people who are known as heroes, I have struggled with them. I don't run around, announcing that kind of stuff because that wasn't a fundamental contradiction. The thing is that whatever errors the Panthers made, they made these errors while contesting, while these other suckers were sitting on benches and in classrooms complaining or lighting candles and praying to, this and that kind of entity. The Panthers mobilized Africans and especially young Africans throughout this country, and they confronted the imperialist state, and the state moved on them with a vengeance. And then to say the problem is internal is just that's part of what we're talking about, that T'Challa is talking about in terms of class struggle. And now many of these folk who had that kind of stance proclaim themselves to be, today, I used to be in the Panthers, you understand? And the reason they can't be sufficiently refuted is because damn near all the Panthers who made a difference are dead or locked up or something to that effect, or who've been pushed out of life. So anyway, that was a really important question that Comrade T'Challa just raised,
Uhuru Chairman. So this study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, winning the war of ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. Did you unite with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. Order your copy of Chairman Amalia Shitella's latest book, Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress at burningspearmarketplace.com. Start preparing now for the African People's Socialist Party's 2020 plenary following our 7th Congress, happening February 1st through the 3rd in St. Petersburg, Florida. Themed, Vanguard Up, Unity of Theory and Practice. The plenary will feature a keynote presentation from our chairman, reports from our party's departments and organizations, workshops on socialism, reparations, African internationalism, and so much more. You can register and read the call to the plenary today at apspplenary.org. On March 27th to 29th, 2020, the African National Women's Organization will be holding the Black Women's Convention, Sisters United for Revolution in Philadelphia. Registration is open for this dynamic event at anwobwc.eventbrite.com. Come see the leadership of revolutionary African women doing the work for our freedom, being on the front lines for revolution. Featured here are presentations from African women in our party and movement, workshops, culture, and so much more. For more information about the convention, visit convention.anwouhuru.org. The Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations is hosting its 4th annual electoral campaign school in St. Louis, Missouri at Aquaba Hall, 4101 West Florissant on April 10th through the 12th, 2020, themed The Ballot and the Bullet. The school is a means by which the coalition opens up a new front of struggle for Black self-determination within the U.S. and elsewhere. The school will teach ordinary Africans, workers, activists, women, and youth how to run for office. The weekend of events will include presentations from the BIB Steering Committee and other special guests. Stay tuned to blackisbackcoalition.org for more details, including registration and our list of featured speakers. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of Amali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru.